I'm Steven Roy Goodman, host of Higher Education Today. Welcome back to the education program that connects you to contemporary issues, people, and institutions involved in the world of higher education. Today's show is thanks to the University of the District of Columbia and KU Leuven. I'm here in Leuven, Belgium, where we'll be talking about the European Union, the Bologna Process, and comparative government. Bart Kerremans is a professor of international relations and American politics at KU Leuven. He is Dean of Social Sciences and teaches courses on government, the European Union, and international politics. Welcome.
Thank you.
Well, maybe if we could start, Professor, thank you again for being on the show. If we could start with the European Union, what do you see as the future of the European Union, and how do you see universities having an impact as to which way the future goes about the European Union?
I don't think universities are going to have a large impact on the direction that the EU is going to go into. But I'm relatively optimistic about the European project, despite the setbacks that the EU has experienced in the last few years. Not just talking about Brexit, but also the Eurozone crisis, the problems with Greece. But the history of the European Union is a history of interconnected crises where solutions were found, sometimes very complicated solutions, leading to a new institutional structure, and then eventually confronted with a new crisis that resulted in a new kind of institutional arrangement. So I'm sure that's going to happen again this time. So I'm relatively optimistic.
And why don't you think universities will have anything to do with that?
Not directly. I think it is going to have maybe an impact on universities, but I don't think that educational policies by the European Union are the big issue today. The big issue is really about the free movement of people within the internal market, the related question of immigration, which is at this moment a huge problem, and of course the economic situation. And these are issues that not directly affect universities. Of course they indirectly affect universities, but not directly.
Well, in terms of the economic issues, which you just mentioned, if you look at the recent British vote in terms of whether or not the UK would be part of the European Union or to vote to leave the European Union, it seemed to me from the other side of the Atlantic Ocean that it was really an issue about economics and autonomy. Is that the way you see it here in Belgium as well?
Yes, but I think it's more a question about who are the winners and the losers in a globalizing economy. And I think that for many people, the European Union symbolizes a globalizing economy with its weaknesses and its strengths. And what we do see in our societies is an increasing polarization between the winners and the losers. And losers, that's what we political scientists know, losers have a much larger say, or they make much more noise, I would say, than the winners do. And specifically in the British case, you also have the role of the media, who really has been very critical towards the European Union since the UK joined the European Union. And it's the combination of these two things. People that are unhappy make more noise. The media picks it up much more readily in the British case, and that combination leads to a small but decisive majority in favor of Brexit.
Do you see other European countries following in the UK's footsteps?
Well, it's not impossible, but I think that what government leaders realize now is how risky it is to organize a referendum on such a case, on such a question. And another issue is that one of the strategies of the current European leaders is to show the member states that leaving the European Union is going to come at a relatively high cost, so as to make it much less attractive than it seemed to be before the outcome of the Brexit referendum.
Well, how does an average person in Greece or Romania feel about the administrative infrastructure here in Belgium in terms of the regulations and in terms of the extra taxes that they have to pay for the services from the EU?
I don't think that many people in Greece or in Romania really have a detailed knowledge about what the administrative side of the story of the European Union really is. They may have a perception that it is relatively bureaucratic, maybe that it comes at a relatively high cost, although that is really very relative. That the officials in Brussels are well paid, which is true. But I think that when they look at the European Union, they look in the first place at the European Union and the consequences of the EU for national budgetary choices or national budgetary decisions. And that is specifically the case in Greece, of course.
Well, and in terms of, to get back to the universities, and I realize the universities may not be the central focus of every voter in Europe, but are there things that European universities could do to encourage or discourage more dialogue about the European Union structures?
Certainly. I think we are training future societal elites. And so what we offer those future societal elites is tremendously important for the way they are going to think in the future about Europe, about exchange with other countries, empathy, the extent to which they develop empathy towards other cultures within the European Union, tolerance vis-à-vis diversity, cultural diversity, that is tremendously impacted by what we organize for our students. And in that sense, the organization of our programs, the promotion, the active promotion of student exchanges is of tremendous importance in the longer run.
You mentioned the elites just a second ago, and one of the criticisms that we have in the United States about government, and there's a lot of discussion about that right now in my country, is that people in Washington may not necessarily be listening to the average person on the street, and they're focused on the elites. And some of our universities face that same criticism, that we're training the elites, but not necessarily the quote-unquote average person who doesn't see why all these structures matter. Do you have that same debate here in Belgium and throughout the EU?
I think we do, and increasingly so, because it is part of the whole polarization. If you look at the more vulnerable people in our societies with respect to globalization, these people are, in most of the cases, people with lower educational degrees. So they are more vulnerable, they are weaker, and they really feel also that way. For them, it's very difficult to understand the other group, the group of the winners. But it also works in the other direction. Yes, certainly, you see that in the university. If you look at the sociological environment of the university, and by the way, that's more the case in the United States than it is specifically in Western Europe, but still, I mean, universities are places where middle class and upper class people study and live together. Their backgrounds are certainly not backgrounds to make it easy for them to understand where people in a more vulnerable position, what they experience and why they are afraid of what's happening, certainly.
Well, my understanding is that KU Leuven has, and I don't mean to be impolite, but KU Leuven has not reached out to the great middle class. Is that not true, or am I getting a misperception of the university?
Well, the KU Leuven is of course part of this country, and we have a very long tradition in this country and in Western Europe in general to what we call democratize higher education by lowering the financial barriers for people to get into the university. And I think that Western European countries have been particularly successful in that regard. But it doesn't mean that all groups in society have succeeded in getting into the university. People whose background are more in, I would say, blue-collar environments, also immigrant communities, they face much more difficulties in getting into universities. That's not just an issue of the KU Leuven, it's an issue of universities in general in Belgium, in Flanders.
And how about some of your students? I know you're a dean now, but before you were dean, presumably you spent a lot of time talking to individual students.
Yes.
Did you have some students who came from non-elite backgrounds as some of your star students, or did you not have that many of them?
Not that many of them, to be honest. No, most of the students, almost all students, are really typical middle class students, yeah. Basically, my own background is a different kind of background. I really have a different background than most of my colleagues have. I did my secondary degree in technical school, which is really, for somebody who is in political science, a complete exception. And for that reason, the kind of sociological background that I have is really different from what most of my colleagues and even most of the students have. And I can really see the difference. And I can also see and feel the difficulties that people have in a university context to develop empathy for what the experience of people in more vulnerable categories of the population is.
And how did your educational background benefit or not benefit when you were in Washington? I believe you were at George Washington University.
Yes. I'm a political scientist, so I think that Washington, and specifically interested in American politics, so being in Washington, D.C. was for me wonderful as an experience. Another element that was relatively new for me was that I was teaching students who were a little bit older on average than the students that I meet here at the KU Leuven. Some of these were working in some of the executive departments in Washington, D.C. So they had some professional experience and also maturity that comes with that kind of experience. And that made it for me a tremendously interesting period.
Fair enough. Could you say a word or two about the Bologna Process? I'm not sure that every American viewer is familiar with what that means and to a European student.
Well, what it means for a European student is that the structure of our university education has been, I would say, become more similar across different EU member states. Specifically in this country, that had a tremendous impact because we organized our university education in a completely different way. So we needed to adapt that, and it's the bachelor-master structure that we currently have in Belgium as well. And so in that sense, the Bologna process had a tremendous impact on how education is organized in our universities. And
to discuss this a little bit more, does that mean that a bachelor's degree now is 3 years?
It is in Belgium, yeah. In the UK it's 4 years, for instance, but here it's 3 years. And then we have, and that's typical for Belgium as well, we have on the Flemish side a number of master's programs of 2 years and a number of master's programs of 1 year, whereas on the Francophone side, all master's programs are basically 2 years.
And what language do you teach in when you teach here?
Most of the courses that I'm teaching are being taught in English and Dutch.
And what about a French-speaking student?
They have to learn Dutch or English. If you get as a student in the bachelor programs, most of the programs here in the bachelor programs are in Dutch. So then you have to master Dutch. There's a strict language legislation that exists in this country. Language is a very sensitive issue here.
I've been noticing that since I've been here. And to an American, that's kind of an interesting issue. Why is it such a sensitive issue?
Well, it has to do with I would say, the linguistic history of this country, and specifically the Flemish part of this country, which makes that having higher education in Dutch is a relatively recent phenomenon. Only a few generations are in that situation here. And that makes it, of course, very sensitive to preserve university education in Dutch and not to make every university program in English. The attitude of the Dutch, and by Dutch I mean then people in the Netherlands vis-à-vis language is a little bit different. They face much less, I would say, psychological barriers to organize their university education, specifically at the master's level in English. Here, that's much more sensitive. We always look at the compromise, which means that we have programs that we organize both in Dutch and in English, and that has tremendous consequences, of course, for professors, because that really doubles the teaching load that they have.
Well, and politically, as you no doubt know, there's been some discussion about some of the security issues in Belgium and how the language issues have affected the inability of the police and the national police to make this 100% more secure. Is that a fair criticism?
No, I don't think it was a language question. I think it was an organizational question, specifically in Brussels. So it's related to the whole setup of the Brussels capital region, which is still, characterized by a number of very small communities and a fragmented kind of police structure. That was the big issue, not a language issue. It was presented that way, but that's the way people look at Belgium. And by the way, when I'm talking about people, specifically foreign journalists look at Belgium, I'm reading a lot of foreign journals every day. One of the things that really struck me, I give you an example of one newspaper, one British newspaper, when there was a debate between the majority and the opposition about security policy in Belgium, it was presented as being characteristic of a fragmented society, whereas in every normal democracy, you have a debate between the majority and the opposition. But it seems to be that people that look to Belgium almost immediately interpret any kind of discussion that we have as an issue between the Flemish and the Francophones, or as a representation of how fragmented this country is or must be.
Well, that's a fair point, because I think you can say that about any number of countries and any number of debates,
Yeah.
right? If you have a lens that you're looking at a political situation in a particular way, and no matter what the issue is, you're always going to keep going back to the original point that you had,
Yes.
then that's not really a fair and intellectual debate.
Yeah, indeed, yeah. And I think political scientists are the people that have to point at that. We are the people who have to point at the fact that maybe some reporting about a country is a little bit too much determined by the traditional perspectives that are being applied towards that country. It's the same with our perceptions on the United States, for instance.
Right, and I suspect that that's so. But as someone who, I guess now that our show is international, I guess I am an international journalist as I'm covering different universities around the world.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe I'm guilty of the same thing, right? Because I'm preparing for each segment, but I'm thinking about, well, what are the major issues, both from the perspective of American viewers, but also from the reality of what's going on at that university and that country at that moment.
Yes, but that's in itself not a problem. I think questions are never wrong. Questions are never a problem. It's a question of the answers. I think if there is a certain perspective being used to look at a certain country and that perspective does not reflect accurately the reality in that country, well, those that are providing the answers should really point at, other dimensions that may be important when you look at that country as well. Like I indicated for Belgium, the fact that there is a debate between the majority and the opposition is very healthy for democracy, whether that is here or in the United States or in Australia or wherever. But it's not a reflection of the fact that this country is by definition more fragmented or, from that perspective, more problematic than another country would be.
Well, Norway is not in the European Union,
Yeah.
but is a Western European country.
Yes.
How does Belgium deal with Norway and universities in Norway, or is there any tie at all?
There are ties, but I cannot speak for Belgium in general, but we do have ties. There are very good universities in Norway in my discipline and the social sciences in general, and specifically in political science. Some of the top institutes are in Norway. Now, Norway is part of the European Economic Area, which basically means that in student exchange, also the whole tuition thing that is applied to students, they get preferential treatment, just like all the other member states of the European Economic Area.
Well, maybe if you could say a word or two about that economic exchange for students, because I think that would be interesting for American viewers to understand a little bit more.
Well, if you are involved in the exchange under the traditional Erasmus programs, it basically means that you are enrolled in one university and you can follow part of your study program, normally a semester or eventually a year, in another university. And the credits that you get there need to be translated from the system of that university into the system of your home university. And one of the things that we have is a lot of students in our universities go to universities abroad. The problem a little bit with Belgium is that Belgium as such is not very, or doesn't seem to be very attractive for foreign students. Foreign students like to go to other places than to Belgium. So we have a lot of work to do on that part, I guess. Our reputation, the perception that people have of our country.
Well, that's interesting, because the other day I met a bunch of exchange students from Portugal who are here, who are studying as PhD students here at KU Leuven, and there seem to be a number of them.
Oh, but we do have foreign students. I'm not saying that we don't have any foreign students, but what we do see in the exchange is we try to realize reciprocity, meaning that the number of students that we send away is equal to the number of students that we receive. For some places, the exchange with some places, that is a problem. Specifically if you go to the UK and if you go to Northern Europe. That's a problem. Belgium doesn't seem to be that attractive, or unknown, relatively unknown.
Well, what could KU Leuven and other universities do to make it more attractive, in your opinion?
Do what we do, which is basically being a very active player in international exchange. Try to involve our professors in the exchange as well. Our professors going to other places and vice versa. And of course, giving the students that come here the best kind of experience that they can get, so that when they return to their home country, that they have a very positive message about what their experiences were here in Belgium and at this university.
Could one of your students do an internship at one of the European institutions in Brussels while they're here?
In my faculty, we have what we call voluntary programs, and we also have a number of programs in which internships are being organized. Yes, they can. Yeah. The big challenge in those European institutions, specifically as a Belgian, is to get in there and to get in there in a very attractive place, because it's a very huge bureaucracy, and I think for social science students, not every director general is as interesting.
And what about American students who come here? How do the American students who come here fare in the social sciences, for instance?
We have very good experience with American students. One of the things that are characteristic for American students is that they are very demanding. So they expect a much more, I would say, personalized approach than what we are used to. But at the end of the day, most of these students are very, very happy with their experiences here. One of the programs that we have is a master's program in European Studies. We try to attract more American students since a number of years, and we are getting successful in that exercise. And the reactions that we get from these students is that it's a completely new kind of experience that they have here, but a very, very learning experience.
And how would that be different for them than, let's say, going to an English-speaking university in the UK?
The language situation is different, of course, and it makes it more challenging, but also more interesting for them. Of course, they go to courses in English here, because we have a lot of English courses on offer. But still, the cultural environment is difficult, is different. So they need to make a larger effort to get into, I would say, the cultural context. So I would say the cultural distance between the US, whatever that may mean, because the US is also very diverse, and the UK is smaller than between the US and many countries in continental Europe, among which Belgium.
When you raise the issue of culture, if you don't mind me asking, how would you characterize, and I realize this is a gross generalization, but the American student versus the Belgian student in terms of culture?
Entrepreneurial, I think, is the largest difference. I think American students tend to be more entrepreneurial. They are much better in getting into debates as well. In a classroom, they will immediately, get into a debate. The difference is, I think, that specifically with respect to Flemish students are much more cautious in terms of a debate, but they tend to focus more on the development of a very strong knowledge base. So American students face a lower threshold to debate about things that they really don't know a lot about. Flemish students will be very hesitant to engage in a debate, even on topics about which they know a lot. That's, for me, a very big difference. So in a classroom, you don't have to challenge American students to get into a debate. You really have to prod the Flemish students to do that. But as soon as you get the two groups into a debate with each other, they learn a lot from each other.
And what about students who are going abroad from Belgium to the US? Presumably KU Leuven, of the many students here, many have made their way to the US over the years.
Yeah. For them, it's a life-changing experience, almost without any exception. It's a different culture. They are stimulated very actively to develop their debate skills, which is really, for them, kind of a tremendous added value vis-a-vis what they get here. Yeah. But they always start with a very strong knowledge base. That's one of the big assets that they have when they go to specifically master's programs in the United States. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting you say that. I don't know if you know this, but a number of kids in the United States, high school students, enroll in programs that focus on debate. We have quite a few programs for young people specifically about debate. And so it's not uncommon for a lot of students when they get to university to have a lot of debating skills before they even get to university.
Yeah. Well, the situation here, there are also programs in that sense here, and I know from my own kids that there's much more attention to that in secondary education now than it was in the days that I was in secondary education. So that's a difference, but still, you see that Flemish students on average tend to be more shy than American students, or also British students or Dutch students. It's one of the complaints you also get from Dutch professors that start to work here, that they say, those Flemish students are very difficult to get into a debate, but as soon as they get into a debate, they are very interesting to listen to, so yeah. It's part of our culture. I think we have a stronger, I would say, authority kind of culture.
Well, fair enough. We only have another minute or two left. Is there anything that you wanted to say directly to the American public about KU Leuven or about Belgian universities?
Belgian universities are very good universities, even if I'm saying it, because probably I'm not very objective because I'm working in such a university. But anyhow, Belgian universities are very good universities. The KU Leuven is among them, a very good university. This country is a small country, and that's one of the big benefits. You are, I wouldn't say in the middle of Europe, psychologically maybe you are in the middle of Europe, not geographically, but you're in a small country. So there is a very rapid kind of contact with other linguistic cultures. You're very rapidly in other countries as well. It's a very interesting place to live. The only negative side in this country is the weather. That's the only negative side.
The weather.
The weather.
All right, well, we won't talk about the weather. We'll leave it at that. Anything else you wanted to say about the European Union before we say goodbye today?
The European project is much too important for too many people to collapse under the recent crisis that we've been experiencing. The European Union brought a lot of peace and stability in Western Europe for decades now. And I think that at the end of the day, people realize that over there is the added value of the European Union.
Well, on that note, thank you, Professor. If you would like additional information about Bart Kerremans, please visit kuleuven.be. If you have comments or suggestions about higher education today, please send an email to our viewer mailbox at highereducationtoday@topcolleges.com. Thank you for watching. We will continue to bring you quality discussions about important matters in today's college and university world. Please join me again for another edition of Higher Education Today. I'm Steven Roy Goodman, and you've been watching Higher Education Today.